Good morning, everyone. Please turn with me to Second Corinthians, the 6th chapter. Second Corinthians, the 6th chapter. As we look today at the title, subject maybe, the two towers. The two towers. The two towers. Drawing on, yes, the famous Tolkien book, The Two Towers. And if you didn't know, as I learned this week, was titled long after it was written, not because he just wanted to get the work out and somehow find a title that fit later. No, he had pressure from his publisher, apparently, to title a work that he had been pressured to once again artificially divide. And so, struggling to find a title for that middle portion of the trilogy, he came up with the name of Two Towers. And I was wondering and looking at the lesson and seeing these polar opposites, for lack of a better term, rising up through Second Corinthians. I wanted to know, why did he name it the Two Towers? And so I thought I would look online to find opinions of some of his greatest fans who were all greatly split on why he called it the Two Towers. And it seems to go back to the fact that he was pressed to artificially entitle the book. And so there's different opinions as to why he called it the Two Towers or which two towers it represents. I can't go into it because I've only seen the movie, haven't read the books. Our experts might have a better idea having looked at it more closely. So I won't get into it. I don't even remember what I came up to in my Siri search. But understand, when Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, unlike what I've heard about the meaning behind the names, whichever two towers it refers to in the book, sometimes it looks at the title from the perspective of Tolkien writing about our heroes in the book going against two great forces of opposition. Some, because of the way that the book was covered, said, no, it's more of a traditional good versus evil narrative behind the title. But it's indescript. And here in 2 Corinthians, it is literally Paul in many ways talking to us about two strongholds that can take root in our lives and hearts as people. And so what is Paul talking about in 2 Corinthians? When most of the letter seems like it's devoted to Paul dealing with his enemies, what I really started to see this time is, as we've talked about before, one of my favorite Christian artists said a while ago, my biggest enemy is my inner me. I've said it before. And the more I looked at 2 Corinthians, the more I saw it as an appeal to examine my own heart for the seeds of those two towers. And if we look in chapter 6, what we'll start to see is Paul using a term that appears more than any other epistle I was able to find. It appears 15 times in 2 Corinthians alone, much less the two letters that I was reminded by another teacher this week that comprise his longest treatise to any single church. Why is this one word come up over and over again in his address to this church? As we begin in chapter 6, verse 11, we have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open, and that's the word. It's heart. It comes up 15 times in 2 Corinthians in many different contexts. Verse 12, you are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children, widen your hearts to us also. Skipping down to chapter 7, verse 2, make room in your hearts for us. We have wronged no one. And here over and over again, as I begin to run into that word hearts and then kind of look at some of the context in which he used it, I started to see Paul was leading with some of the things that we talked about in class this morning. There are times when a rebuke is necessary, but speaking to the potential of the people to whom you are talking is more important than speaking to the issue. That's what we talked about this morning. And so in all of the things that we see Paul dealing with in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the fact that he takes time over and over again to talk about the role of his heart towards them, in spite of the issue that he may be addressing, whether it's divisions or whether it's sexual immorality or whether it's simply food sacrificed to idols, things that you don't think you should necessarily have to talk to about a church that he had worked with for more than a year and a half already, right? He's saying the bottom line is, I love you, right? And so when he's using that as his foundation or recurring theme in letters that he starts off, one in 1 Corinthians talking about thanking God for the grace that is given them. And then last week, as we talked about, starting out in 2 Corinthians, talking about speak comfort. Because through all my afflictions, I've been given my afflictions to speak comfort to you. And then in beginning the book, much like he did in Romans, where he talks about, he's talking or writing Romans to bring about the obedience of faith. He begins the book with that, and he ends it with that. He begins 2 Corinthians with encouragement to comfort as you've been comforted. And he ends it with a call to comfort one another. And in between, he's talking about his love for the Corinthians over and over again. And sometimes it can be hard to see why. Because sometimes in straight talk, it can be hard to see the love. But that's exactly what he's reminding them about as he goes through each of these topics, we'll call them, that can be otherwise seen as sensitive issues in the church at Corinth. And the fundamental thing that he's talking about is making room in your hearts. Why is that so important? Why is that so important? Because as we go back through 2 Corinthians, beginning at chapter 1, there's another word that came up over and over again. And this is what really sparked that interest in the two towers. And it's a word that we use commonly. I could dive deep into the Greek and literal meanings and figurative applications of it, but it's just the word but. And so I don't think we need to get all that deep. Because what he says is over and over again, much like Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard, but I say to you. Paul sets up this contrast between the kinds of behaviors that the Corinthians have fallen into and the reality of what can truly pull them out of their current mire and conflict. And why is that important? So we talked about last week this whole issue of no matter where Paul was, the ability in comforting others to find joy. Like our brother read this morning from 2 Corinthians 11. Through all the things that Paul had been through, he doesn't write from a perspective of being defeated and overwhelmed. He writes from the perspective of an overcomer. And so we talked about when we're going through things, it's one thing to preach it, it's one thing to demonstrate it in your life. And what we see in Paul is one who clearly has given an indication of how he has overcome. And we said, if comfort is going to come from me, hey, I may be able to come up with the right word at the right time. I'm more likely to find the wrong thing to say. But if it's going to come from God, whether or not I find the right word or the wrong word, it's going to be something that sustains you, whether you are in the top floor of the most regal office buildings or castles in the world, or whether you're locked in that building's dungeon, a servant. And so the endurance that comes from God is one that sustains you no matter what your condition is. And that's the difference between a pat on the back or some affection that can come from a friend, no matter how much you love them. It's going to be temporary. It's not going to sustain you for very long. It's like we've talked about before, it's the drug dilemma. Sometimes we look at people with drug habits and we look at them and be like, oh, so sorry, tis, but we forget the ways that we have in our own lives the desire for a salve to ease the pain. And we forget how temporary that healing often is, especially on emotional wounds. And so we can be so locked in the chasing of one thing that can get us from moment to moment of emotional healing that we forget just how much of a hamster wheel that we're on in seeking comfort. And the thing that Paul is setting up here is a contrast between the things that provide temporary comfort and the things that provide lasting peace, whether it's, once again, the dungeon or the penthouse, as it's called. And ultimately, it starts in chapter 1, where he talks about, really in a lot of ways, 6 or 7. Y'all know I lean towards 7, so it might not be perfect 7, but I'm going to say it's 7. Red flags for that contrast between temporary comfort and lasting peace. And the first thing he's going to say starts in chapter 1, verse 12. For our boast is this, the testimony of our conscience, that we behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and supremely so toward you. For we are not writing to you anything other than what you have read and acknowledged, and I hope you will fully acknowledge, just as you did partially acknowledge us, that on the day of our Lord Jesus, you will boast of us as we boast of you. That contrast, just in case you missed it in chapter 12, was not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God. And that goes back to what he talked about in 1 Corinthians, as we talked about in class, not only Wednesday, but today. One of the manifestations of their divisions had to do with the debates that were cropping up. And he's talking about, look, one of the red flags for a temporary bump or a temporary high is ego. Needing the kind of praise that comes from, as we talked about before in prior classes, when we go back to Romans 1, Brother Don had mentioned that the danger in debate is the rivalry. When I get that win, it feels good, but how long does that last? How do you feel when you look at somebody who's going back to their high school accomplishments or puts on that old letter jacket? You're like, look at me. It doesn't last very long. Why? It's dated. Because if I really did it, I would have done it at another level. I might have gone to college, played there. And if it really had some meaning, I might have gone to another level and done it in the pros. So when you see me reaching back for those glory days in high school, you see that I'm trying to fill an emotional void that letter jacket just wasn't meant to fill, right? And that's the same thing that happens when we drag out accomplishments of any kind, whatever is important to you. Marcus kills the sports analogies. That's my limitation. Make the application for you. You know what's important, and you know what it's like in those times when you want to feel appreciated. And so you reach back to something, or you say, you recount an accomplishment fondly, and you get the look on the faces of those you're telling, and it just don't hit the way you thought it would. That's basically what's going on here when he's talking about not speaking of earthly wisdom. When I'm tempted to speak from earthly wisdom, it's because I want to sound smart. I had a boss one time in a performance review said, Marcus, you're trying to sound smarter. I was like, ouch. But it was on point. And another one of the bosses at the firm, he knew what it said. And he was like, Marcus, here. All right, calm down. What he's telling you is we trust you. And you don't have to put an extra oomph behind what you say because we hired you, because we believe that you can get it done. And you don't have to impress us. You're impressing us is getting it done, winning, blah, blah, blah. And so after the ouch, it was like, thank you. Because it takes a load off to know that you're trusted, right? And so that's what's going on here with Paul. When he's talking about the kind of encouragement that endures, when you have the ability to lighten your load, the need to try to sound smart, you can simply function to the best of your potential, not having artificial goals stacked onto the burden that already is what feels like. I don't know what your cross feels like. Sometimes mine feels heavy. And I don't need extra drama attached to it for my own insecurities. And so that's what he's encouraging them to do. Let go of the extra that you're encouraged to do so you can just lift that cross, because the cross is heavy enough. Chapter 2 is going to talk about another but, or another contrast. Beginning in verse 15, this is, pray for me, this is a temptation to really go off because this is a sermon unto itself. So I'm going to try to be disciplined and just stay on message. With chapter 2, beginning in verse 15. For we are the aroma of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To one, a fragrance from death to death. To the other, a fragrance from life to life. Who is sufficient for these things? For we are not like so many peddlers of God's word, but as men of sincerity, as commissioned by God in the sight of God, we speak in Christ. Understand the subtle difference. He's talking about we're not peddling the word. And it can sound so sinister when it's easy for me to look at the TV and look at that rich minister and be like, he's peddling God's word. I'm doing it right. But no, we said these scriptures are most important when they are applied to the temptation. I mean, why? Because we talked about it before. I go through deprivation long enough and I'll be that guy. It's one thing for me to preach in a perspective where, thank you, you have taken care of my basic material needs, so I don't have to, like Paul, write about, I deserve to get paid too, right? So I can preach this passage from a perspective of being at a congregation that's trying to take care of my material needs. There's another thing if you just burn through it all and you're just like, look, Marcus. But I try to respond to your efforts with an effort to try to at least be reasonable. I'm not great with budgeting, but you know. But the reason why I say that is if I go back to a point in time where I was trying to stretch to make ends meet, on a mission field to turn a mission that was designated for a certain amount of time that had a certain amount of funds, and then try to stretch that years beyond the financial allotment. I can start to look a lot more like that preacher I point the finger at on the TV with the rich ministry. Why? Because the one thing I learned about the mission field is poverty has the same effect as riches. It's almost two sides of the same coin. Either one can distract you from simply focusing on your goal. So if I got too much money, my temptation is to protect it, which is one of the things that almost kept me out of ministry in the first place. God, I'm kind of comfortable. I want to serve you. Kind of. How much is it going to cost? Okay. But then the flip side was poverty, and I got to see it close hand. Money becomes an obsession in a place where it's in short supply. It's a basic principle of pricing, supply and demand, right? And it works on the human psyche. And so when I look at this, Paul is talking about, yes, financial stability gives you a certain level of peace, but that's not the kind of peace that sustains you in both poverty and riches. And what God is saying is, to the degree that you begin to look at the word as a source of material gain, is you're really simply looking at a false peace. It's an idol. And it's one of the reasons why he literally said greed is idolatry in other parts of his epistles. It's because that says, Paul quoted, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And once again, it is another false comfort. Why? It comes and goes. It comes and goes. One of the punishments that God's promises, the wealthy, the wicked who amass their wealth, they simply store it up for who? The righteous. Because there are times when he just allows us to look at it. It's like, how long is this going to go on? In issues of justice, when we look at the Bible and we look at what's going on in the Word, we look at ourselves sometimes, as we talked about in class this morning. Paul deprived himself of legitimate things, the right to be paid by a congregation, the right to carry along a believing wife, the right to eat and drink whatever he wanted, right? So that he could be a more effective minister. And so there are times when we'll look at the world and we're going through that same thing. We might not be great at sacrificing everything, but we're sacrificing something to serve God. And we look at a world of indulgence and privilege. And we're like, I know it's not supposed to be on my mind all the time, but Lord, it is kind of hard to look at every now and again and wonder how long. And so sometimes we can be tempted to look at the seemingly joyful life on the other side of the fence with that green grass, right? As we've heard the proverb. And even though we've said time and endurance often have a lot to do in our ability to be, great Christians, it's one thing if I look at that person on day one and I see how green the grass is on the other side of the fence, but it's another thing after a month or a year or years of wanting to see how well things are going on the other side, and then to have to look and say, oh wait, like we said before, that same temptation that I see in the rich preacher on the screen is one I'm now having to deal with as well. So we talked about in class this morning, the difference between jealousy and envy. We said, even if I'm not leaning in, or a person who's naturally given to envy, if you put me in enough deprivation, I'm gonna start to resent a little bit. There's songs about it. Now, I talk about my favorite Christian hip hop artist. One of my favorite non-Christian hip hop artists who I can't quote has this song called Got. It's talking about there's just certain things you don't do around people who are struggling. We're happy for you that you're doing well, right? But you got to realize you're putting yourself in a lot of jeopardy when you're flashing, or what we call flossing, around people who are starving, even if they aren't given to envy. That's one of the things that I think my brother can agree with. The mission field teaches us both. As Americans, people already know we got it. But you have to show that you love the people who you're around by keeping a lid on what you got and how much of a blessing it's been. Otherwise, it just tempts them in ways that just don't need to be tempted, right? And so what he's saying here is that contrast is, even beyond that, once you've gotten to the place where you're taking a consideration for your brother and sister and how either your success or your failure is affecting them, understand financially, no matter where you're at, the money's a false comfort. Why? Because the true comfort that comes from God will sustain you whether you have much or have little. Goes on in chapter 3, beginning at verse 4, for our third contrast. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim that anything is coming from us, But our sufficiency is from God, who has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And understand the contrast he's saying there, not to claim that anything is coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God in those times when I'm not doing such a good job at citing the source of that thought that seems like it might really go over well in the sermon or the lesson. Those are times when I want to take credit for the thing. Going back to our original lesson, I just want to sound clever. I want to be the one who sounded like they had that original thought. And the reason why this is so important to me is because sometimes we talked about that whole concept. When you have people who are coming in either through the media or visitors, people have different things that are emphasized in their places of work, in their professions. And in the profession I was in, site checking was a huge thing because authority, and going back to the original, authority mattered. And so when you have people who come from that tradition where refusing to cite a source is akin to fraud, then you have to be very careful as people, especially when we take the pulpit as ministers. They're looking at us through that lens. They're like, wait a minute, if in the secular world it's important to credit your source, but you're playing loose with that as the quote unquote man of God, what's really going on? And so people who have no priority for God, but who from a practical perspective understand the truth and integrity that comes from citing your source, they're holding us to that standard. And sometimes it's easy for us to forget that God is holding us to that standard too. And so when we are talking to people out either in the world or in the church who come from different places where site checking is huge, we got to be careful that we don't lean into the temptation to want to take credit for stuff that's just not ours, right? Because that reflects on Christ. That reflects on God. And no matter whether or not I got all the words in order and the sermon sounds homiletically perfect, if folks know I ripped that off from Francis Chan, then it's going to just diminish the quality of the message. Matter of fact, I've seen it before. People on YouTube who were just straight up enough, ripping off, I would call it the balance beam illustration. You look up Francis Chan balance beam. It's a great illustration he used one time for how sometimes we can lead a life of normalcy and as we dismount in death and going to heaven, expect the reward of what we see at the Olympics, a perfect 10. And he uses a balance beam to illustrate that. He says, we'll lead a life sometimes that hugs the balance beam and inches our way toward the end. And then we'll get off and then we'll dismount as though we did a back somersault gainer, whatever you call it, right? And we expect a perfect 10 for a 2 performance, right? And I saw another preacher who did that. I was like, dude, you know where you got that from. And I looked at the comment section. I didn't say anything. Everybody's like, you stole that from Francis Chan. He was like, he went like, yeah. He's like, shut up, right? And so sometimes it's the response, right? It's just, we know that sometimes we just borrow, but when people know the source, just acknowledge, yeah, I did get it from him. He's a great teacher, blah, blah, blah. So I appreciate the idea. But sometimes we want the credit so badly that we get angry when we get held accountable for the fact that we got it from somewhere else, and we just didn't want to either give credit for it, and we get a little bit ticked off at the fact that we got called out on it too. But look, we all go there, and it's a struggle for us all. But understand, when you look at the theme of both of Paul's letters to the church at Corinth, he's talking about understand the larger implications of your actions. That is the tie that binds all of these butts between these two towers. The one tower that leans into temporary satisfaction, and the one tower that is a true stronghold that provides peace. The one thing that always helps you understand whether or not you are leaning too heavily towards one, or the tower that leads to temporary satisfaction is, are you doing this for the good of the group? And if you're site checking, that's clearly something that's done for the good of everybody who listens to you. Why? Because sometimes it's good to go back to the source. I might not be an expert on that thing. And so I went to someone who gives you the opportunity to search more deeply. So if you search more deeply in the library of my stuff, you might not find any more insight on that particular topic. But if I'm actually giving you the fact that I got this from such and such, he or she actually is an expert on that. And if you look more deeply, if you really need healing, that's where you need to go. Because that's the godly perspective. I'm never the source anyway. The bottom line is we're all pointing back to Jesus. But if I'm so preoccupied with needing the credit, I'm not giving you that one step. I'm not giving you the one step closer back to him that you might need, which is somebody who just knows more about the topic than I do and is taught more in depth on it. And so if I'm thinking of the good of the group, one of the reasons why I'm site checking is giving you the place where you can go to get one step closer to the actual source. So moving on, chapter 4. Not sure where to start. Let's just start with verse 1. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word, but by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded their minds to the minds of the unbelievers, to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. And I skipped one, but we'll go back to it at the end of chapter 3. But understand what he's talking about here is one of the red flags is who's the boss, right? One of the things when he's saying simply the contrast is what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ. It's an illustration I've gone back to before. One of the best managers I ever had was a guy who was just really kind. So if I'm looking at this letter to the 2 Corinthians and he's talking about over and over his heart towards the Corinthians and the love he has for them, this man never told me he loved me. That could be awkward in the workplace. But just by the way we related, he just showed me and demonstrated that he cared and he wanted me to do well, right? And so ultimately what happened was in that relationship, just as he showed affection to me, I had to show it back to him because he didn't always give the best instructions. Sometimes he would tell me to do stuff kind of off the top of his head, and he would state it as a law. Okay, we never do this. We only do this. And then it wouldn't take very long before we'd have to be like, okay, but wait, not in this situation. And then maybe not. And so ultimately, what gets us through those times, it says love covers a multitude of sins. And so going both ways, the fact that I knew he cared about my best interest, I knew he wasn't telling me because he wanted me to do wrong, right? He was just doing the best he could. And the reason why we were able to work well together is when I sometimes went to what he was telling me, he'd be like, okay, wait a minute, this is how we'll do it. We were able to kind of find together the path that helped us both get to where we needed to be. Why? Because he trusted me enough that when I was kind of wincing at the instruction, I wasn't trying to undermine him, right? And I trusted him that he was trying to guide me in the right path. And so with that, that's what Paul is talking about. This man did not feel the need to proclaim himself as the authority. He was simply the authority of that time because he understood that as he was trying to guide me in the way that I should go, he might not get it right all the time. And that's what Paul is talking about here. When I'm looking for that temporary comfort that comes from being listened to, sometimes I wince at someone who's not so much sure about what I'm telling them to do if I'm not completely secure in my relationship in the word. And so we'll say it like this. The more confident I am that, I get it wrong from time to time. And that before you've spoken a word, I try to get in the habit of saying it to myself. The less I tend to lord over you and wince when the issue of making a mistake comes up. And so that's what Paul in a lot of ways seems like he's talking about here, is that Christ is the ultimate authority. So if I am wrong, it happens from time to time. And we can grow together the more our hearts are together in terms of we are all aimed at the same place, trying to get the same direction in the best shape we can. Because it's one thing to get there tattered and torn down and beat up, right? But it's another thing to be able to make sure that we're just walking all under a heavy cross in the best shape that we can once we arrive. And so that's what I think he's talking about here. When we are in positions of authority, whether it's in family or in church or in workplace, it's understanding that sometimes the criticism that comes up from below isn't a personal attack as much as it is an attempt to get everybody to the same place in the best possible shape we can, right? Backing up, the one that I missed in chapter 3, confusion is another hallmark of that other tower. Chapter 3, verse 14. context, let's back up to chapter 12. Verse 12 in chapter 3. What he's really talking about is the veil that remains over the minds of the Israelites when they were listening to the law of Moses. They could never fully understand it. And that's what he's getting at as an illustration here. Verse 12, chapter 3. Since we have such a hope, we are very bold, not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. But their minds were hardened for to this day. When they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. And here's the thing. We talked about it before from the Gospel of John. It's that whole concept of we know the thing that allowed the blind man to see, even though he had possibly never been able to read the scriptures for himself, since it says he was born blind. Even though these scholars weren't able to see who the Christ was, were two simple words. We know, followed by, this man can't be the Messiah because he's got the wrong doctrine on the Sabbath. And we said, once you do the math wrong, I'm terrible at math, but I know how to get it wrong. If you get it wrong early, all your work later ain't so good. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe I'm thinking of algebra. But I used to get it all wrong pretty much all the time. So I know mistakes early don't usually turn out for great results. And so that's what happens. When they say we know, part of the reason why they miss the Messiah is because early on in their calculation, they needed him, right, to agree what they already believed in. That's what we talked about, that whole concept of down in chapter 4. Who actually is the Lord of my perspective? And as I am now stretching on to the 30th minute, once again, giving myself a reason. Oh, this week I'm going to preach shorter because it never works. But this is going to be shorter because I'm only at minute 31 right now. I'm counting. Ultimately, when we look at this thing, we have to wrap this up because we're not going to get to all of them. We'll look at them, but we won't talk about them in depth. The other contrast, there's really only one more, no, two more that I found. Chapter 5. Other contrast, beginning at verse 14 of chapter 5. For the love of Christ controls us because we have concluded this, that one has died for all. Therefore, all have died, and he died for all, that those who might live might no longer live for themselves, but for the sake of him who died and was raised. And it's that contrast of the one tower, the temporary comfort comes from me living for myself. And why is that so dangerous? Why? Because 40-year-old Marcus is different from 80-year-old Marcus. God willing, there's an 80-year-old Marcus. Anyway, the wisdom at least that 80-year-old Marcus or 80-year-old any of us would have, hopefully would say that my perspective at 40 doesn't really know what's best for me. And so not understanding what's best for me in the small term can often cause me to do damaging things under the perception of this is what I want and this is what's best for me right now, which is long range, not always. So I don't even know what's in my own best interest. Just like Paul said, I don't have anything on my conscience, but that doesn't acquit me. My self-interest is fluctuating. It's unstable. Because it's limited by my realization of only what I understand right now. We've talked about it before, just in terms of the demons, not even God. We're dealing with Satan. We're dealing with the demon that's thousands of years old. And just think of yourself with thousands of years of wisdom compared to the wisdom that you have sitting here right now. Do you really know what's in your own best interest? And so when I'm trying to seek after what's in my own best interest, I really don't even have a good clue as to what that is long term, downrange. And so the danger of living in self-interest is not only is it just a temporary high, it's a temporary high that sets me up for a damaging course of reconstruction sometimes, right? We talk about rebuilding. We talk about the rebuilding years that come from sometimes, you said 1 step forward, 2 steps back. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Those 2 steps back, sometimes it can just be a matter of simply putting a couple of steps forward to recover. But the further you drift off that path, the longer the process of recovery, right? And so that is what we're talking about, trying to mitigate what we call opportunity cost. All the things I would have had an opportunity to do while I was recovering instead of simply moving forward. And that's the danger of self-interest, is it's often short-sighted. Last example I saw was in chapter 6, beginning at verse 11. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and this is back to where we began. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted by your own affections. And that brings us forward to chapter 10, because when he says you're restricted by your own affections, the path to true healing comes in destroying whatever strongholds I have built up against true, enduring peace. And that's the war that really is the fight for my inner me. In chapter 10, I think Paul wraps it up when he says in verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. And once again, we said it sounds like he's talking about the external adversaries that he had in the church of Corinth. But if you have any idea how this letter ends up, Paul ends up talking about his own thorn. And so even in talking about external adversaries, Paul is wise enough to never let it stray very far from the knowledge of his own struggle. And there's plenty of debate as to what Paul was talking about. Was it a physical ailment? Having known me for a year, y'all know I'm probably pretty biased. I think he literally meant what he said. I think somebody sent him a messenger from Satan to harass him and remind him of his frailties, no matter how much God had blessed him. That's just my opinion. We tend to look at these things through our own lens. So I'm not preaching that to you as gospel truth, but I'm preaching it to you as that literal thing he said about his thorn. I think it's possible and I think it's true, right? And so with that, what he's really saying is, look, in opening or in pleading with them to open their hearts up to him, he's really going to that whole concept that we talked about, going all the way back to the Psalms when David talked about my refuge. Over and over again, the word refuge came up in the Psalms as a place to where David ran in his times of difficulty and stress, whether it was the stress that was caused, like we said, by his own sins after he was finally relieved of his external stresses of running from adversaries. Either way, God was his refuge. And here's the thing. The reason why those two towers are so important is not necessarily for the towers, but it's the defenses that we build around them. When you look at old castles, they sometimes might have had a moat and a wall and a defense system that was designed to defend the structure. It's like we have security systems and locks and cameras on our homes. And here's the danger of those two towers. See, it's not simply running to one tower or the other. It is the wall that we build up in defense of the tower that we have chosen. And that is what Paul is trying to break down here. See, he's saying you not only have to choose the right tower, part of escaping the wrong tower once you get there is tearing down the barriers to truly hearing where God is leading you. And that is the battle that he's fighting in the hearts of the church at Corinth as he writes to them in what we have as 2 Corinthians. It is, Corinthians, understand, like our brother read in Micah, consider your ways. Which one was that? Yeah, exactly. We'll find it out later. One of the minor prophets. The theme is consider your ways. In a lot of ways, that's what Paul is talking about here. Understand which tower that we're in and understand the cost. It's like Jesus said, count the cost of being his disciple. Sometimes we have to count the cost of recovery and whether or not we have actually built up walls that are shutting out the potential source of our healing. It summed up for me this way just yesterday when I was listening to, of all people, Kevin Hart, who has a podcast. And he has a lot of different comedians. He calls it Great Minds, like M-I-N-D-S. Gold Mines, comedy gold mines. So instead of gold mines as digging up gold, he's like the mind is the source of the true value. So he brings in all these different comedians that we generally look at as just being funny people, and he tries to mine their experience for actual jewels of wisdom that people can use in the time where they're more and more tuned into podcasts than actual interaction in the days of COVID. It was a COVID invention. The reason why I talk about that is not all of his interviews go well. And I was listening to one with a particular comedian I was a huge fan of. But sometimes when you get two great talents together, it doesn't always go so well. We talked about that right before in terms of playing team sports, just in the not in the respect of all my overblown professional sports references, but just in playing team sports. Sometimes it brings that out. And so what happened was these two comedians were starting to butt heads, and I was about to turn it off because it was so much friction. I was like, I don't want to listen to this. It's Saturday. But as I sat and I listened, over time, what I started seeing Kevin Hart do was something I've seen him do over and over again. And he simply spoke to the best in this comedian over and over again until his walls fell down. And the first half of the conversation that was mired in so much conflict melted away to an actual conversation that once again lived up to the title of the podcast, actually ended up being an actual gold mine as he mined this man's experience for wisdom that we could all use. And so that reminded me so much of what Paul says as he closes out this letter in 2 Corinthians in chapter 13, where he says in verse 10, "For this reason I write these things while I'm away from you, that when I come I may not have to be severe in my use of the authority the Lord has given me for building up and not for tearing down." And for so long I read that verse, I was like, Paul, that's just I don't read well in English, Paul. I need you to reword that. But simply enough, God has given him authority to do two things. And see, sometimes that's exactly what God has given us. I heard someone else this week when he was talking about this individual he was interviewing. Kevin Hart is a believer. He might not always sound like it if you listen to his jokes. But the gentleman he was interviewing is an atheist. And he was talking about how I used to be a rabid atheist. And over time, what I realized was everything I hated about Christianity, I was starting to see in my own community. The condescension toward the other side, the short-sightedness, the inability to see value in the other opinion. And Kevin Hart was like, oh, wait a minute, I understand. I can't remember what he said, but bottom line was they both had the authority to tear at each other or to build up. Oh, yeah. One of the things that used to cause this man who was an atheist to be turned off to Christians was I forgot it just a quick again. Sorry. Let me read the passage again. For building up and not for tearing down. Okay, I'll have to conclude it a different way because I really did forget. But the bottom line was both of these men had the ability to dig further into each other as they were kind of having goes at each other through the first half of that podcast. And what they chose to do eventually was to build one another up. And that is what happened over time. See, that's one of the things I am working on. I am often stubborn in stuff I want to do, my tower. And so if I see the way that God is leading me, speak peace in a situation where you fully have the authority to do something else. If it doesn't work that first time, I'm like, oh, see, that didn't work. Back to my tower as I build the wall back over my way. But if I learn to be, as a phrase I've used before, stubborn in a good thing, just as stubborn in that thing God is telling me to do as I am in my tower, then over time what I begin to see is, oh, wait a minute. Not only do I, as we talked about it before, begin to understand God's wisdom from his perspective and his rules no longer rule, I start to see the wisdom in it. Then I start to see the benefits in my life. It wasn't the first time that they tried to get themselves out of that cycle of picking at each other. They got them out of it. They had to endure in saying kind things about one another before they actually found a place of genuine peace. And so as we are building or trying to make a hard decision about which tower we're going to lean into, understand sometimes it simply takes endurance in that thing that God has told us to do that doesn't seem like it's working right away. And if we are just as stubborn in trying to adhere to his will as we are to that other tower, I think it's going to prove over time. I'm confident it's going to prove over time a lot better than that tower that gives me quick hits and great disappointment. Quick hits and great disappointment. And if I can invest time in the quick hits, I can invest my time into the peace that surpasses all understanding. So my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we learn to be stubborn in a good thing and to be the things of peace.